Alright, so we've got this 1967 M715. It's a Jeep military pickup truck. This truck was a military police truck for the Army. Yeah, there's U.S. Army registration number under there somewhere. It's like Air Force blue and olive drab green. So there's, I guess, all sorts of agencies were using this thing. Anyway, it's been sitting for at least 20 years before I got it, and I let it sit for 2 years. So we know it's been sitting for 22 years. Most likely this thing hasn't been touched since the early 90s. It's got what appears to be a 12-volt alternator that's not the original factory alternator. That starter, I'm pretty sure, is a 12-volt starter because I tapped a battery onto it, and it cranked over pretty good for 12 volts. This solenoid here looks like a 12-volt solenoid, and the factory of these things didn't come from the factory with solenoids. They came with very large foot switches to start the engine. And then the problem we have here is we have a factory distributor which is 24 volt. So underneath this whole boondoggle, you've got a positive 24 volt cable going in right there. Whoops, right there. That powers the coil, the condenser, and the points with 24 volts to make the spark, which goes up and lights the spark plugs and makes the magic happen. So we have this half-converted 12-volt thing. This is how I got it. I got it non-running. I think they got through the conversion and were stuck on the distributor, so they stopped, let it sit until they could solve the problem, and then never solved it. Finally gave up and gave it to me. So now we have the distributor as the last component to be changed. Now I've pulled out probably a mile of wiring in this thing, and we're basically starting from scratch. So what I did, just to make sure the engine cranks, I took a battery, a nice new well-charged battery, put jumper cables on it, ran one cable to one side of the solenoid, and pulled off all the cabling that was on there, so I'm not powering anything inside the truck. I'm not sending 12 volts to the coil. All I'm going to do right now is crank the starter a couple times and get some good old-fashioned fogging oil run through the engine and into the cylinders to lubricate them a little bit. Normally I would pull the spark plugs out. I'd spray some fogging oil in there and let that sit for a couple days before I even try to turn the motor after sitting for so long. Unfortunately, as I was doing that, I don't know what I did, but somehow I leaned on the fan and I turned the engine. But the good news is it turned pretty easily, which tells me it was not seized. The bad news is that I didn't get to lubricate it first, so if there wasn't any surface rust in these cylinders, that surface rust got dragged up and down and probably scored up the original cylinders. It's not the end of the world. This motor's probably not going to stay in this truck if I keep it. We'll see what happens. Anyway, so I sprayed some fogging oil down the throat of the carb right now. That's why it looks wet. After 20 plus years, it certainly wouldn't look wet. And then I'm going to take this switch I fabbed up here real quick. It's running across the switch lead of the solenoid. We've got positive over there coming from the battery, direct off the jumper cable, negative on the body, and the output runs through this ridiculous cable down to the starter. So now we will crank it. Not bad, not bad, right?
No.
Pretty good. We'll try again. Alright, I can hear compression in there, so that should be good news. Let's get some of this stuff in there.
For an old military truck that's been sitting for 50 years or something.
Yeah. Suck some of that oil in there. Yeah, this thing is turning great. Alright, let's see if we got some heat going on here. Yep, this wire's getting a little warm. There's a solenoid. The solenoid is nice and cool. There's our negatory battery cable. Not bad. Yeah, let this sit, let the starter cool off for a minute. But that's awesome. That thing really is cranking. Let's see if I can crank it a little bit by hand. Oh yeah, look at that. Oh, ooh, not so good. That must be on a compression stroke. So that's a good sign. If I'm stuck on a compression stroke, then that means I've got compression on at least one piston, one cylinder. So who knows? The rings could be stuck and we could have a junk motor. But in the meantime, that's our M715.